He was an unstoppable star defensive back, shown here playing for the San Francisco 49ers, and hometown fans were absolutely wild about him. Kermit Alexander, a kid who grew up on the gritty, hard-knock streets of Watts in Los Angeles, had escaped a life of crime to live the dream. But then, everything Kermit believed in, and his whole world of celebrity was suddenly sidelined by an act of unthinkable brutality. On a searing hot August Friday morning, evil thundered into his mother's home. His mom, Ibora, nicknamed Medee for Mother Dear, his sister Deetra, and his two young nephews, Damani 13 and Damon 8, were gunned down execution style. The boys still in their beds. Kermit's mother was the first to come face to face with the executioner.
She would probably have said, "Kermit, that you?" No answer. And as the footfalls continue, she then must have looked and seen a gunman looking at her. 3 shots are fired, literally blowing her skull off. Then they went to the front room where his sister, Deetra, who was 24 and about to get married, and 2 of his nephews, Damon and Damani, were asleep. And Deetra was shot 3 times and killed, and each of the boys in their sleep shot through the head.
Another nephew, Ivan, hides in the closet, while Kermit's younger brother, Neil, scuffles with the killer and slams the gun out of his hand. The killer lands on a trunk by the door, then wrestles back the weapon.
He then takes the gun, whacks Neil in the head with it, and runs from the house. Had Neil not put up that fight against him, there probably would have been 6 bodies instead of 4. From that point on, you have a complete murder mystery.
It changed who you were at the core.
Normally, you don't live through the kind of devastation I went through. I went into isolation for a period of years.
Every time Kermit closes his eyes, he sees his mother's face, and the horror plays out in his head.
She sacrificed her whole life for her family. She disciplined us. We were going to be good citizens or else. I'm sorry I'm getting a little emotional, but when I talk about family, that's the only time I do get emotional. It's so important to me because they sacrificed so much to get our family to a position where we could take care of ourselves.
Incredibly, Kermit was supposed to come to his mother's house for breakfast that morning. He had landed a gig as a sports commentator, and he wanted to surprise her with the good news. Instead, that day of carnage would rip out his soul and turn him into a hell-bent vigilante, armed with the verse of revenge from the book of Matthew, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth.
I was the shadow figure roaming the streets, interrogating, intimidating, assaulting, being as vicious as I had to be to get the information I needed, and it became very apparent that something terrible was going to happen if I ever found him.
To add insult to his tremendous loss, at first, police investigators eyed Kermit as a person of interest.
They didn't suspect that Kermit had done it, but they thought that somehow his fame must have had something to do with it, have drawn the fire in some way.
And also some business deals they thought maybe that Kermit was involved in may have led things down this path.
Some of the detectives said they would, prowl around the streets 24/7 trying to figure out what had happened, and there just were not any leads.
Kermit's family is overcome with grief and living in fear.
We didn't know if the rest of the family was still being targeted. And the worst thing could happen is if we're at a funeral, the rest of us get killed. So we had a heavy police presence. It was devastating because we were all on edge. And because I was the focal point of the family, everybody looked at me. You must have done something. And as a result, the rest of my family accused me of having my family butchered.
Kermit was consumed with guilt for not being there to protect his family. Their slaughter consumed him. He wanted vengeance and wasn't going to wait for cops to catch the maniacs who did it. Kermit set out to find his own street justice, vowing to become a killer himself if he had to.
I knew the streets. I knew the hood. I knew the gang members, but nobody knew anything. And to my chagrin, I brutalized a lot of people to try to get the information, but they didn't know.
On the street, he had heard a Crips gang member had been bragging about blowing a woman's head off. Kermit went ballistic, trying to track him down, but cops warned him to cool his heels.
I'm walking the streets looking for the killers of my family. And I'm not caring about the law. I'm a former probation officer. I know about the law, I understood it, but it was family.
Were you armed?
Yes, I was armed, and I was armed both physically and emotionally. And my job was to find out who it was that did this and get rid of them, period.
Police want to avoid bloodshed, so they haul Kermit in and offer him an unusual deal.
So they said, we can't stop this guy, we can assist him. The proviso for being assisting is that once you find the person that you're looking for, then you gotta give us first crack at him.
Up next, Kermit gets a tip, identifying the killer. And he's frantically trying to find him before the cops do.
All I was doing was grabbing gang members, and if they didn't know anything, I'd beating them to a pulp and then moving on. I was hurting a lot of people unnecessarily.
And we expose the mindless motive behind the execution-style murders.
No one had any clue why this family was gunned down in a daybreak home invasion homicide.